Okay, so I'm going to get going. So we have an action-packed schedule for you today. So hello, welcome, and thank you for joining us at this online workshop as part of Hastings Digital Museum at Hastings Museum and Art Gallery. You are at Create a Minoan-inspired Kylix decorated with symbols inspired by nature or your culture. And I'm Charlotte Haley-Watts. And this is Alice Roberts-Pratt, the curator at Hastings Museum and Art Gallery, for those who didn't hear me say that right at the beginning. And I'm going to hand straight over to Alice to give you a few more details about the webinar and some housekeeping, and then we'll get started.
Hi everyone, so just to let you know that this is going to be recorded and then later shown online as part of Hastings Digital Museum. All your cameras and microphones should be muted. If you've got any questions, if you can type them in the chat, we will have a moment at the end to questions and answers, and there will be a comfort break halfway through.
Okay, brilliant. So I'm just going to very quickly recap the running order of the workshop so that you know what's going to happen and what order things are going to happen in. So first of all, Alice will introduce the Kylix itself, the very beautiful object that we're making these objects inspired by, and some other objects from the museum collection that are related to the Kylix. Then I'll ask Alice a few questions about the object, the Kylix that is, and then we will watch the pre-recorded making demo for the Kylix inspired vessel. So during this demo, I will also highlight the easier making option, which is to make a cup or a two-handled cup. And so as we go through the demo, I might say something possibly at one point about which parts you need to stop at if you're taking the easier option. So I'll probably talk through that a little bit more just before we start the demo as well, actually. And then we'll have a 5 to 10 minute comfort break. So you can get up, have a move around, make a hot drink if you've got time, and then a run through of how you can decorate the Kylix after it's dried. And then finally, we'll have some questions and a little bit of information about the online exhibition, which you can join with your Kylixes if you'd like to. So over to Alice, well, over to me to interview Alice now about some questions relating to the Kylix. So
Introduce the objects first.
Yeah, you can introduce the objects first as well.
So bring this in very carefully. We can all see, so this is a Minoan stem cup or a Kylix, and this was collected by J.K. Hewitt. This one's from the late Helladic through B period in Crete. There's lots of different periods in Minoan culture. This one's from the late Minoan period. It's painted with a row of brown stemmed spirals, and it's decorated with what is believed to be a cuttlefish inspired design. And we'll talk about Minoan design in a bit. It was purchased from J.K. Hewitt, probably of London, by the Wentry Trust, who then donated it to the museum. We haven't got any information about Hewitt himself, but it would appear he was a collector of rare antiquities. Then the artefact itself entered into Hastings Museum's collection in 1962, and it was the first of a pair of objects that made up the 22nd entry in the accession register that year. So that is the Kylix. And I'll move on to this little fella. So it's a Cypriot figure of a bull. Don't know if you can see that. It's quite nice. So R.A. Higgins, who was the assistant keeper of the British Museum, wrote on the 21st of January 1956 that the bull is Cypriot of about 1450 BC. It may, as you say, be in some way associated with the Minoan cult of the bull, but the fabric is local to Cyprus, and the cult may also be local to Cyprus. And this is from the Brassey collection of 1919. So the bull in Minoan culture was an important animal, with its presence felt in various forms of art and visual culture. Depictions of the animal vary, with some showcasing the bull as a symbol of strength and fertility, while others emphasise its connection to divine power. Horns in particular were widely utilised in the consecration of Minoan shrines and palaces, and different types of horns were used as decorative elements. And you can really see these at Knossos if you're ever on Crete.
So from seals to frescoes and other visual arts, the bull is a consistent visual symbol, and the animal is often depicted in visually striking ways with its power and strength emphasized. And this is in keeping with the cultural importance attached to the bull in Cretan society. The significance of the bull as a sacrificial animal is well documented, and it might also be associated with gods and goddesses from ancient mythologies, such as that of King Minos and the Minotaur. So it's quite interesting that the bull is depicted here. All right. On to the final object I'm going to show you from our collection that's kind of related to the Minoans, is this Cypriot stirrup jar. So the stirrup jar is of Mycenaean type, but was probably made in Cyprus between 1600 and 1050 BC, so it's Bronze Age. A stirrup jar is a type of pot associated with the culture of Mycenaean Greece. They have small, squat bodies, a pouring spout, as you can see there, and a second non-functioning spout over which the handle is connected like a stirrup. So during the late Bronze Age, they were used in the export of oils and are found in large numbers at sites around the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. Despite its association with Mycenaean Greece, this stirrup jar has been argued to be the stirrup jar has been argued to be a Minoan invention. But this one's from the Brassey collection of 1919. It's a nice little pot.
Thank you, Alice. And you might want to take some inspiration from those items when you decorate your dried kylikes as well. You could include things like balls, or you could take inspiration from the decorative stripes on the pot, the stirrup pot, isn't it? Stirrup pot. So you can see Alice is the expert on the objects rather than me. But I'm now just going to ask you a couple of questions, Alice. So how would objects like the kylikes have fitted into Minoan society, and how would they have been used?
Okay, so the kylikes is the most common type of wine drinking cup used during the Minoan period.
So both the shape and the vessel and its marine motif in this case are typical of the pottery production at the Palace of Minos at Knossos on Crete during the period from about 1350 to 1300 BC. And this was a period of growth and prosperity for Mycenaean and Minoan societies. So standardization in both the forms and decoration of pottery developed among widely spread communities, evidence of organized society and highly centralized cultures. So the stemmed kylikes was one of the most popular vases in this period, and enormous quantities of these vessels were kept in palace storerooms to furnish large banquets. So many have also been found in sanctuaries where they would have been served as ceremonial function and perhaps used for cult activities such as ritual drinking.
Thank you, Alice. I learned a bit more there about kylikes as well. I've read a little bit, but it was really useful to have that extra information. So what do you feel are the key decorative motifs of the Minoans? And when I say motifs, I mean the sorts of patterns and symbols you might see on their pottery. What do they represent, and what do we know about them?
So in the early Minoan period, you often see kind of very simple patterns such as spirals and triangles, lines, crosses. But then slowly, as they got a bit more confident, beak spouts were produced and things like that. But it's really what the Minoans are famous for is kind of during the middle Minoan period, it's the naturalistic designs. So you see fish and squids and kind of octopus kind of all over the pots. And that is probably because the Minoan civilization flourished as a seafaring and mercantile culture. The vibrant culture was centered around the island of Crete, which eventually dominated the Aegean region. And the Egyptians actually called the Minoans the sea peoples. So that's really what we're seeing. They're decorating their pottery with stylized versions of what they saw around them. And you can see this reflected in their frescoes as well, particularly at Knossos.
Thank you. So the final question, I mentioned in the demo that you'll see that the Minoans would have hand-built their pottery, probably with coils and slabs, just like we hand-build pottery today. But what else do we know about their construction, and how do we know it?
Well, we see again in like you said, the early building methods hand slab made and coiled during the early Minoan period. But by approximately 1900 BC, the pottery wheel became available, which was 200 years into the middle Minoan period. didn't invent the potter's wheel. It was known in other parts of the Aegean prior to becoming widespread on Crete. Its introduction was a good chronological marker, as turned ware is easily identified compared to hand-built ware. And we do see, you can see a real kind of typological element with Minoan pottery. You can see it goes from kind of bulky, bulbous, thicker ware, which is the handmade ware, and it becomes a lot more thin and refined and beautifully decorated. And there was technical advancement with cross-draft kilns in the final Neolithic pit kilns. There was the separation of heat source and wood fire from the pottery zone. So the development of the wheel and the kilns, the way of firing things, really kind of helped develop it. So we can see that in the actual typological artifacts.
Great, thank you so much. So we're now going to play the demo. We've pre-recorded this partly so that you get a really good view of the hands. Don't worry, there'll be plenty of opportunities to ask questions, and if we run out of time at the end, you'll be able to ask questions via email. Everyone should have my email. So we'll start this without further ado. Just a quick word on that as well is that if you want to take the easier version of making the cup form or the two-handled cup form, I talk about that towards the end of the demo. But in terms of what you'll need to keep an eye on during the demo, it's making the base. That will be exactly the same whether you're making a cup or a kylix. You might just choose, if you're making a slightly smaller cup because you want to make a smaller cup, you might make a slightly smaller base. I have a cup which I'll talk more about later, but my cup is quite small and I made quite a small base to go with the cup, but I still stuck to a kind of similar style of handle to the kylix, so you still get that feel of a Greek vessel. So you'll need to start with making the base, and then when we go on to make the bowl of the kylix, I call it, so the larger, the drinking bowl section of the kylix, you'll also be making that. But again, you can decide to possibly make it a little smaller than the kylix vessel, but that comes up again at the end of the video, and this will all be recorded, so if you want to watch it back, you can do. It might feel quite fast, so just do as much as you can live while we're doing it. It'd be great to hear afterwards how you get on. And if you need more time, you'll be able to watch it back online. It should be launched online in a couple of weeks. So thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you enjoy making your kylixes and cups. Okay, so for our first demo, I'm going to show you how to make a vessel based on the kylix that we've just looked at. So you're going to need the kit. If you've had a kit sent out to you, not everyone will have done, because there's a limited amount of kits. You'll need your ball of air drying clay. I'm actually, just for the record, I'm using kiln firing clay, so it will look slightly different from what you got in the post, but that's okay. It's exactly the same process. So you'll need your ball of air drying clay. If you are working with kiln firing clay because you have kiln firing clay, or you have an access to a kiln, you'll need that. You'll need the plastic knife that was sent out in the kit, or if you have another kind of knife that you'd like to use, like this pottery knife that I have, you can use that too. You don't need a pottery knife, you should still be able to cut the clay. You can also use wire, it can be quite useful and quick for cutting clay as well. You'll need something to flatten the clay for the base. A roll, like a household rolling pin, is all I ever use, although you'll want to give it a really good wash if you're going to eat or make food with it afterwards, because you don't want to get clay in your stomach. So you could, if you have a rolling pin at home, you could cover it with something while you're using it, or just wash it really well afterwards. You also will need a small cup with some water in it, or a jar, or whatever you have. You might find you'll need your paintbrushes that you were sent through the post. You might find, if you've got an old spray bottle that you can fill with water, you might find that useful. If your clay's drying out, which sometimes it does particularly quickly with air drying clay, you can then get a fine mist of water. You don't really want to over wet clay because it becomes equally unworkable when it's too wet. So try not to do that. And I think other than that, yeah, you just might want something like, my dog's eating this, so it's a bit rough and ready, but you might want something like a regular sponge that you just cut a little bit off, or a bank card, or anything that you have that you think might be good for smoothing down the clay, or any clay tools. If you happen to have any clay tools at home, you can use those as well. So saying that, you can equally do all of the smoothing for this project with your fingers. In fact, the example I made, I didn't actually use any tools at all. I made it quite quickly and I did do it all with my fingers. So it is possible. So if your clay feels too wet, you might want to wait a little bit before you're working with it. Sometimes clay, when it's fresh out the bag, is a little bit too moist. So have a little feel. See, I mean, you can see there's a bit of moisture on the board there, for example, but you don't want it slimy. If the clay is slimy, it might need a little bit of time just in the air before you work with it. One thing you never want to do with clay is you never want to fold it on itself like this, because you're going to trap air in it. And with air drying clay, that doesn't matter too much, although it can make it more prone to cracking. But with kiln firing clay, you might find that your object explodes if you've trapped air inside it. So that's a really important fundamental thing. We're going to make sure when we're working with the clay today that we don't do that. The other thing is that when you join two bits of clay together, I'm just going to demonstrate with a really tiny bit of clay off of this. Say I'm going to join that piece to that piece. You don't just whack them together like that, or fold them together or try and mold them together. For a really good join, you always want to do something called slipping and scoring. And that's just using any sharp edge to, you might have seen the back of a brick before, like a house brick. It's all textured. And you want to do the same thing when you're working with clay. So your two pieces, whatever they are, they both need to have a good texture on them. You then add water or slip. So slip is clay. It's like water with a very high content of clay in it. So you can make it yourself with your clay by just adding some clay to water and sort of mixing it around and chopping it up. But because my clay is a good wetness, I'm happy just using water today, because you can see it's kind of creating like a wet slip on top of it. Once you've added water, I recommend, some people say this is too much, but I recommend that you then do some further texture, because you can never have too good a join. And you'll see when we join the stem, the long piece, to the base of the cup, you definitely want a really nice join. So you then, let's match these up. It will be better if we match them up. Okay, so they're kind of like this. So you then want to push, if you're joining clay on clay, you then want to push the pieces really well together. You should find that there's a bit of friction if you try and pull them apart. If there isn't, you probably want to, without actually squishing the clay too much, you probably want to just apply a bit more pressure. It's a bit like gluing something to something else. And then you, for a really, really good join, you probably also want to then smooth around it a bit so that there isn't any kind of potential kind of air where it's got wet, and you've just got a really, really good solid join. I've actually taken quite a big lump off my clay already, but you want to probably take about I would say about a third of the clay maximum to make your base that you've been sent. So you're just going to cut off a nice big chunk, and then you're going to use whatever you've got to flatten
your clay to roll it out. So something I haven't mentioned actually, that I meant to mention at the beginning, is you'll need either something round to draw around to make your base of around 8 centimetres across. So you can see I've just made myself a card template, and that's about 9.5 centimetres across. Doesn't have to be a particular size, but you need to think about what is a good size base to support the stem and the bowl of your calyx. So you can either just draw straight round something once you've rolled out your base, or you can have a template ready and use that. So I've got rolling guides here, which are 0.5 centimetres. You might want a thicker base than that, particularly if you're new to working with clay. It just gives you a little bit more leeway. You can make guides by cutting up wood, but I wouldn't say you need to do that. I've just got these so that I know that my base is going to be nice and even for this demo. If you've got kind of more time, or you're not trying to work quickly, I would say just roll it, and you should be able to tell by eye. But the important thing is you'll see ridges in your clay if it's uneven. But if you can see on mine in a second, you'll see it's really, really flat, nice and flat and smooth. And that's because it's the same, what's the thickness? It's the same thickness all the way. So phew, that worked perfectly. There we go. You never know, the moment of truth. So what I would suggest you do before cutting out your base is that you make really gentle marks round either your round object, just like a dotted line or something, because if you go straight in with the knife and the clay is a bit too wet, you'll probably find that you get a not very nice, not very clean line when you cut it out. So I think doing a bit of a dotted line first really helps. You then, I usually just cut in like that and then cut round. I would say don't worry too much if it's not a perfect circle. You are cutting freehand. So this is where, you might decide you'd actually prefer to keep your round. If you are using a round object to cut round, you might want to keep that on there while you cut. You will find that it's not going to be a perfectly beautiful line. So we save all our bits of spare clay in case we can use them for something else, or you might just want to make something fun if you've got some left. So you'll see this isn't a thing of perfect roundness and beauty at this point. This is where you need to come in with your hands or a smoothing tool to just kind of make this much more much nicer, really. You would have noticed on the Kylix, it doesn't have this kind of slightly unattractive, completely kind of straight line. It's more of a disc shape. So I then suggest that you kind of go in either with a sponge or again with your hands, and you're just going to try to make that outer angle not so flat and steep, because it just doesn't, it looks like you've just cut a circle from clay, which is what you have done. And this is the thing with hand building. So you may be familiar with throwing as a different technique. It's thought that, Minoans would have hand built everything, probably either using a coiling technique or the sort of technique possibly that we're using today. It's hard to know exactly how everything was constructed, but when you're hand building, you have to think about, your lines a lot, and also, you might want to spend a lot of time refining things to get a really beautiful shape, because we are essentially working with flat parts, which we're then building into a whole. So you want something that looks harmonious. So that's a good start for a base. I'm going to leave mine there for today. At this point, you might find it useful to measure the sort of widest, well, if it's a perfect circle, it should be the same all the way around, but you never know. So you're going to kind of half that, so you've got a center point to work from in a minute, which you will need. You don't have to do this with a ruler. You could do it by eye. I'm only doing it with a ruler because I know that I'm under scrutiny, so I'm doing this publicly. So I've marked the center roughly, which is about there. That's just going to be helpful later. Don't go all the way through or anything like that. So we've got our base, which is very exciting. We're now going to make the stem of the cup. So you need a good chunk of clay for this, for sure. Possibly about half of what is left, depending. I already cut quite a lot of my clay, but so you can probably, what we want to work with is a kind of fat rectangle cylinder thing. So I've just cut a bit out, and now I'm going to work it with my hands into a kind of, so remember what I said about not folding clay. You don't want to fold it, but you can pat things into shape a little bit. And so I'm trying to get this into like a kind of rectangle cylinder thing that I can make the stem from. I'm hoping this is going to be enough clay, but I've taken a little bit less than a whole line because I wanted a nice rectangle, but we'll see how this gets on. So you can see I'm just patting, because in a minute we're going to roll this out. So if you start to get sort of any folds appearing, just smooth them out so that you're not accidentally starting to fold the clay in any way. So I think I'm happy with that as a kind of starting point, because what I'm doing now is I'm going to make what's called a coil out of it. We don't want this to be too thin, but we don't want it to be too thick, because if it's very thick and you're using kiln firing clay, you are going to find that the thicker your clay is, without hollowing it out, it could explode. So to avoid kind of the extra step of hollowing, just try not to make this too thick. So you want to use this kind of pad of your hand here, the first part of your hand after your fingers, to create a coil. I'm going to turn this around a bit because I don't want to kind of bang it into my base while I'm rolling this out. I'm going for roughly a sort of, and kind of keep turning it so that you're not only working on one side. I want kind of like a maybe 8 centimeters, possibly slightly less stem out of this. So I can see now that I'm definitely going to get that, and I definitely don't want it as thick as this. If your coil starts getting a bit uneven, like mine has, or it kind of starts folding itself on one end, you can just kind of pat it back into shape. I've got arthritis, so my coil rolling is not always the best, actually. But my clay, this clay that I'm working with, is also quite, it's great, but it's got a lot of what's called grog in it, which is like to make clay stronger and more malleable, really. So it's great for hand building, but it's also, it's very hard. It doesn't become very soft and very plastic because of the grog content. So I'm still rolling. So basically, if you've got more than you need, which I definitely have, and you should have too, because I would rather tell you to use more of the clay you have left than not enough. So you're going to probably find that if you've worked out you've got too much, again, you might be able to cut a bit off and roll a bit more from there. All this spare clay, please keep it. We're going to definitely need that for handles. You might even want to add relief decoration, which is where you cut 3D decorations out and add them onto your pot. But we're going to make a plain Kylix without relief decoration in this video, because we're kind of mirroring the style of the Kylix from the museum. But if you want to add relief decoration, you can. So we're starting to get there now. So you really want as much of an even, you know, you want it to really be a perfect cylinder as much as possible. You can look at it on it, you know, that might help, because it's all very well looking at it flat, but then when you add it, you might suddenly think, actually, that is really thick, or actually, that is really thin. I'm not going to go any thinner than that at the moment. So, or in fact, at all in this video, because it's not going to hurt you to have a nice solid base for the bowl of the Kylix, the part that the liquid would be in. So you want to smooth out, give it a nice smooth out. You probably want to cut off any uneven ends, because you can see just there, that often happens when you're coiling. That you, so once you've got a nice, you know, pretty much uniform cylinder, you want to flare out the bottom of it, because that's where we're going to join it. I'd also suggest you try and flare out the top a bit, just by, you're basically making sure that's super flat, and possibly a little bit thinner in the center, as much as you're able to do that without, you know, damaging the stability of the coil. I don't want people to think that it has to look like it's been made on a machine and super perfect and equal, because I think the joy of handmade things is that they're not like that. And hand-built ceramics, you know, do show, you know, signs of making. You might even choose to have, you know, finger marks in your design. That's actually quite a popular thing in ceramics. So you basically, because you found your center, you want to try and sort of match the stem up with the center. I'm also going to check my measurements, because I think that's quite high, which, oh, it's about 10 centimeters. I would say that that's okay. You'll see that that's made a little join mark there where it's where it would sit, and I can see that that's pretty central. That's pretty good. So I'm now going to score where that mark's been left. Not too deep. You don't want to go right through to the bottom of your base. And then do the same on the whatever bit is going to be the bit that joins to the base. Nice texture. Add water with your brush again. Not too much, not too little. I know that's really annoying. I hate it when people say that as well, because it doesn't actually mean anything. But you don't want to, you particularly don't want the base to get too wet, I would say, for this part. So once you've re-textured both pieces, you are going to, this is the moment of truth, kind of, you're going to join your stem. And you know, this is quite a thick stem. You could go thinner, but it depends how big you want your bowl to be, really. And you know, obviously a thinner stem is going to look a bit more elegant, but you probably then wouldn't have a very big bowl on the top. So that, you know, that's the choice. I'm going to try and make a slightly bigger bowl on the top than in my example, actually, because I felt that that was a little bit too wine glass like, that one. So again, remember what I said about kind of giving it a pull to see, like, that's a sign that the clay is really well joined. With this as well, to really mimic a really nice wine glass, not wine glass, but a kind of, you would have seen on the Kylix, again, it's about these smooth lines, not these harsh blocky lines that show that we've built something in pieces. So with a bit of leftover clay that I've got, I'm going to make a miniature coil again to basically to wrap around this, so there's not such a harsh line. You're going to find it harder to use the same coil technique with a tiny piece. So I wouldn't worry so much about using that part of your hand. You just really, this is a bit of a cheat, but you can kind of do it a bit more like that to get it started with a smaller piece of clay. And then you know, if you're making a coil for something, always make a too big coil, not a too thin coil, because if you pick a tiny piece of clay and the coil's too thin, you're just going to have to start again if it's not long enough to go around whatever you need it to go around. When you think you've got your coil about right, you want to do a little measure so that you know where you're going to cut it. So I just usually make a little mark where I'm going to cut. So, oops, don't do that either. Accidentally hit your thing with your knife, because that could send it all out of line. I also didn't say at the beginning of the video, but if you wear rings, take them off. I take off my wedding ring when I make ceramics, because you just end up with loads of nasty marks in the clay, and you're going to double the amount of time it takes you to smooth things down. So don't wear rings. Also, clay gets stuck in the rings. So as you can see, I haven't cut enough off. That's also perfectly normal. You're better off not cutting too much off. You can always make it a bit thinner, not much thinner. So you might have noticed that I added water there as well, where the coil was getting a bit too dry, because if it gets too dry while you're attaching it, it could snap. So for this, I've also done mini scorings each end where I'm going to join the coil together. And I also, you don't need to go overboard, because your clay might be the same. So where there's already a join here, it's very, very wet. And if the clay is very, very wet, you're not going to need to do much slipping and scoring. Some people join clay to clay when it's wet with no scoring. I just always think it's better to be safe than sorry, particularly if you're making something that's taking a long time. And if you make this, you will find that it takes quite a long time, especially if you want it to look really good. And the great thing about clay as well is if you don't like it, you can always sort of start again. If you're using kiln firing clay, just make sure you look up, if you haven't done it before, wedging, because if you want to reuse your clay and you don't wedge it, you will trap air. So where you've got the join in the coil, again, as usual, just flatten it out. I actually find for these really tiny things, using a paintbrush is quite good for joining small pieces. But you can use whatever you want. You also might want to use the end of the paintbrush. This is the thing with the brush you've been sent. You could also use it as a smoothing tool. So this is where you can make a bit of an artistic decision as well. If you've got a very nice coil like this one, it's very even, you might actually decide that looks nice and that you want to make that a feature of the pots. If you want it to look, to do what I was talking about and just make the stem to base line a bit softer, you might need to actually wet this a bit, and then you're going to have to go in with your hands and just start sort of squeezing it so that you are gradually getting this kind of slight, I don't know what to call it really, graduation between the base and the stem. The other thing that I haven't done much yet myself, because it's a little bit more tricky when you're filming it, is that you really do want to, when you're making something 3D, you need to keep turning it because it's very easy to look at something from one angle and go, that looks great, and then realize that the other side of it doesn't match it, or is really off center in comparison. So like now I've turned this around, I'm making some adjustments because I've realized that, yeah, it's a little bit more uneven this side. And yeah, I guess it's a constant thing really of re-evaluating when you're making a 3D piece all the way around something. I'd also say get under it as well and kind of look at it from below a bit sometimes. Try and look at it from above as you're making it, because that's the only way you're going to see if there are. So I wouldn't say this is entirely finished, but you get a sense of what I'm trying to do with the stem to the base here. And like I said, you know, if you're finding that really tricky or it just hasn't worked that well, you can leave it as more of a feature. The other thing that you can do as well is if you get some really wet clay, I mean, I've just done a really cheeky thing there, which is just roll some of the clay that I have lying around in some water. But you can probably see that there isn't a perfect sort of, it's not, they're still looking a bit separate here. You can kind of add a bit of clay in as well. This is where it would, I did say you could just use your fingers, but this is where like some kind of tool could really come in. I haven't actually bought any of my favourite smoothing tools, but I'm going to try using the end of a paintbrush a little bit. So the other thing sometimes is it's better to like come back to something later than kind of overdo it and then realise that you're not happy with something. So like I'm starting to feel like I want to move on to the next step and come back to this base area. For the purpose of today, I'm now going to move on to the next step. You could spend as long as you like doing that, and it's going to look really, really great. So for the next step, this is you'll be relieved, well, not relieved, but once we've done this, you will really feel like it's more of a cup. And it is an option to add handles. If you just get to the point of making the cup and you're like, oh, I'm done now, you can just leave it with a cup top. You don't have to add handles. When I made my first example, I left this to dry out a little bit. As you can see where I'm touching it, it's still definitely wobbly and it's not very solid. And I think, well, this is a thick piece of clay, so it's going to take a little while to dry. I would recommend, if you have the time, and because you can stop and start this demo and it's available as a recording as well, I would recommend that you just leave this, depending how hot your house is, because, you know, I think drier environments, you can leave something for an hour and literally go, oh, wow, that's basically dry now. Yeah, I'd leave it for a little while, come back to it, see if it feels a bit firmer. You don't want it to dry out entirely because it's quite hard to get clay wet again once it's dry, sometimes. But you can, you probably want it to dry out a bit so it's a bit stable, because remember, we are now going to add like a weight on there. And if it's too wet, it's going to go. So you want to get the rest of your clay. And so I've got lots of pieces aside here, which I'm going to use to make the handles, where I've cut bits off bits. But because this is an organic process and you might have made a different size coil to me and maybe not needed to cut off any because it was the right size, or, you know, your base might have been exact or something. But what you need to do is basically take the majority of the clay you have left for the bowl and leave a bit to make handles if you think you're going to make handles. So what I've been doing is I'm just making a ball, and this is called pinch pot technique, basically. You could also make a bowl by coiling if you're familiar with coiling and that's what you want to do, but I'm going to use the pinch pot method because it's really a lot quicker than coiling, actually, and you can kind of get similar results when it comes to making a bowl shape. So you stick your finger, you get the clay into a nice, you know, as even as possible ball. You're going to stick your finger roughly in the center, your thumb, in fact, not any finger, on your dominant hand. Obviously, if you have one, you want it to be that thumb, because that's going to give you a good grip. And then you start turning and pinching. like this, and you're gradually feeling, different people do it differently. Like some people do it a tiny bit like this and then they start opening out down here. Some people get both their thumbs in. I think you want to get a decent opening before you start playing around with it, really, and you want to try and hold it upright as much as you can. I mean, it's what's comfortable as well, but you need to keep looking at it and making sure it's vaguely central. That's really important. So you don't want your hole to go too far off one side, because all the time you're trying to keep the thickness fairly uniform. If you get one part of a pot or shape generally that's much thicker than the other, it causes stress in the clay, and that's when you can end up with cracks. I mean, you can end up with cracks for all sorts of reasons, but where, you know, there's a real difference in thickness, that's a really common source of cracks. So I'm going to get this to kind of a very thick bowl, and then I'm going to show you what we're going to do next to get the shape of the Kylix. It's really important when you do this that you leave enough. You don't want to stick your thumb as you go like right through the bottom. That often is something that goes wrong, is that people put too much pressure and their thumb ends up going through the base of the cup. This is actually a bit thinner than I wanted it, so I'm going to kind of compress it by doing that. I need the base quite thick, because what we're going to do next is we're going to start pinching to get the kind of shape of the Kylix where it joins the stem. We're going to start pinching in the bottom part of the cup. We're going to keep opening out the top as well. So I guess you can do a bit of both, because we want to kind of keep them in some kind of dialogue with each other in terms of their thickness. So I'm just sort of patting round, and I think this is easier to do when the pot's upside down actually. I'm sort of patting round with my fingers to kind of get that. You can only just start to see it happening, but I'm trying to get that barreling out from the stem. So, you know, it's not there yet, but you can get a sort of sense of what I'm trying to do. And then I'm continuing to pinch this a bit as well, so that we don't get a kind of harsh line too much. It's sort of, and this is something that you can really go as far as you want with it, because you could easily just have a regular, it's not a problem to have it more of a regular bowl shape, but it's not going to look so, it's not going to look so much like a drinking cup if you don't have the in and out towards the stem. So again, keep an eye on like how central this is within the cup shape as well. You'll also notice that on the inside, you start to get a kind of, it starts dipping, and you want to make sure that again stays open, because what that does is create quite a nice shape at the bottom of the cup as well, and you don't want that clay to fold in on itself. So being very careful with your nails, or if you have a sponge that isn't super wet, that's quite useful as well, to just go in there and keep that central piece open as you're barreling that in. And yeah, still trying to keep this like a gentle sort of line rather than a harsh a harsh line between where that goes in and out. And you can go backwards and forwards a bit between things if you want. You can do a bit of opening out and then a bit of shaping in, because we want this to kind of open out quite a lot as well. So I'm actually going to do a bit of that so we get a sense. So you're going to kind of avoid your middle bit while you're doing this, and just start to open out the cup more and avoid this space where we've pinched it in, so that you don't lose that part. And keep looking at it from different angles, and check that it's flat as well. So it's worth putting it down, checking it's still flat, and it might start getting quite dry as well, and make sure you're keeping it. So this is where a spray thing is useful, because you don't want to saturate it. You can also just wet your hands as well, but all the time so you can see as well, still the rim is still super thick. There's no way you want the rim as thick as that in the end, because it's one of the amazing things about Minoan pottery is how refined it is, considering there was no pottery wheels or modern tools, and it was all created by hand, probably coiling, difficult to say. So as I said before, if you prefer a coiling method to create this, you can. I quite like the physicality of working with pinch pots sometimes, but if I was going to create a really super large version of this, I would probably coil it, because it does kind of give you a bit more control from the outset, whereas this is a bit more organic. So as trying to keep that nice, so you can see it's getting a bit thinner in one spot than another spot, and cracks are starting to appear. You just have to keep that clay sort of smooth and wet. So if you get mini cracks, you just kind of press, and it's part of sometimes shaping the clay, and there is going to be moderate stress on the clay as you start to pinch out, but just make sure that you're constantly pressing it back in and smoothing it again, and because this is quite heavily grogged. So as you can see, as I've been doing this, I've also been putting it on top, so that I can see how how much it's sitting over the stem, and the stem is only a certain size, and obviously if you overweight the base, you're going to find that it doesn't, if the base is too thick, you're going to find it doesn't sit as well on the stem. So I would keep assessing that as well, because you want it to be, as you can see, my stem, because I haven't left it to dry, is still a little bit wibbly wobbly. You actually want it to be as stable as possible, and a little bit harder before you attach the bowl to it. I am going to show you, this definitely isn't 100% complete. So I'm going to make the handles while this hardens off a little bit, and you're probably also going to still want to do some work on the shape of this as well, and making this thinner and getting a nice soft rim rather than a hard line like I've got at the moment. But if I show you how we're going to create handles, so you can also allow those to dry off a little bit, what you're going to want to do is grab any spare clay you've got left and cut a sort of good wodge, because we're going to make coils again, those pesky coils. So you're going to just roll, and you want to make enough that you think you can make 2 handles with this, because if you make one long coil and you kind of divide it exactly in half, you know your handles are about the same size, which is a quick way of doing it. You can also get much more perfectionist and measure. Yeah, like I said before, probably you don't want to make them too thin. You want to have a bit of leeway if you need to stretch them or something like that. So I'm going to just cut off the ends as usual to make sure I've got like a nice, and then I would actually flatten this a bit. You don't want to kind of really, so I'm going to use this, but you could also use your hand. You don't want a really rounded handle, because if you think about the shape of a handle, it's not, it doesn't stick out. You want it a bit more kind of flattened. And I'm going to make handles that are quite a similar shape to the actual Kylex, rather than going for any kind of super fancy decorative handle. But you can also get creative with the handle and make a more unusual shape if you like. And then this cup is, as discussed, by no means complete, but to shape your handle, you want to think about you know, where you want it to go on your cup. So for example, to get a similar shape to the handle on the Kylex, you're probably, it's kind of got a bit of a rounded shape like that, and then it goes in and it comes straight out from very near the rim. So you kind of want to vaguely shape it on the cup. It actually, they stick out quite a bit, the Kylex handles, and you're going to need a fair old amount there that you're going to flatten. So once you're happy with a vague shape from the side of the cup, I would just literally leave it to kind of slightly harden like that. And then I do the same again, because you're going to want it the same on both sides. This one is actually feeling a bit thicker, but that's okay, because we can always refine it. So again, try and get a sort of similar similar shape. This one's a bit longer, I think, so I might cut it down a little bit at some point. But if you're kind of looking at so you can compare them a little bit when they're down here as well and think, do they look a similar shape, thickness, and just let them kind of slightly, at least form into shape a little bit. In the meantime, you can continue on your main form, and I'm going to pinch this in a bit more. Keep looking at the shape from all angles, underneath, below, and also keep making sure that you've kept this center part nice and open, and it's got a kind of nice bowl shape to it, like that. I mean, this is still, as you can see, very wet, this stem, but that's because I haven't given it any time and it hasn't hardened up. But ideally you want it to kind of become much harder so that it can take the weight before you add the cup to it. I am going to, although this cup is by no means finished, and you want to kind of definitely get a much thinner rim on it and start to make it less blocky and more sort of like this, more of a smooth, even line and a much thinner line. I'm going to show you how you would attach the handles to the cup so that you know what's next. So I would make a mark on one side of the cup. We know we're putting them quite close to the top, like they are on the Kylex here. And then I would use something straight to just make sure that it made a mark in a really similar place on the other side so that they're quite matched and even. I would then I'd pick up one of these and see roughly the size on the pot, and I'd do a bit more. So we're scoring out early on this. And then because handles are quite tricky to join, like you don't want to join part of it on and then do that and ruin the shape. So I would also try and get the scoring for the other part of the handle on at a similar time. So like that. And then I would do the same on the other side. So I would score a small patch there and get my other handle, which is actually a bit longer, and I'm going to cut it down already because I can see it's quite a bit longer than the other handle, and we want them to be quite similar in size. And I'd measure that up against the cup again and see roughly where it's going to sit, and it should be somewhere around there. And then on the ends of the handles, you want to do a bit of slipping and scoring there, and you also, rather than the bottom this time, you kind of want to do it here because that does actually touch the cup. So you then slip and score like that, and then start to join. Hopefully your handles will be a bit more solid when you start joining them. Mine are still quite wet, but you can start to see how they join on. So depending on like how happy you are with, I mean, you want them still a bit wet so you can move them and think about what shape you want, what you like. But we're then at the bottom of the handle, we're going to start to try and kind of squash it on, because this is going to be your really key join, where hopefully you're not going to end up with a really obvious sort of line, and you can start to kind of actually make that blend in with the rest of the pot. You might want to add a bit of water and just start to blend it, and check all the time how the handle's sitting, because you don't want it to start sticking out more one way than the other. You want to try and make sure it kind of has a... So you're going to spend longer on this, but you're going to smooth that bit nicely down so you've got like a really nice join, and it just becomes one with the cup like it does on the Minoan Kylix here. If this is a nice solid join, I wouldn't worry about doing too much around here, because you actually, that's looking like a really sort of nice, neat join. And because you've got this really good anchor point here, you don't need to worry. Then you would do the same on the other side. Remember where you've joined it here, you might want to have to kind of, you might need to flatten that back out again, or you might need to pinch it in again. So you're kind of constantly going back and looking at the shape all the time. I'm going to imagine, like on my example cup, that it's finished and I'm joining it onto the cup now. So obviously you're going to put your other hand on as well, and you're going to check that this is all looking even. And then you're going to, again, slip and score the bottom. So you can see that my base is quite a bit bigger than what I'm joining it to. And you actually don't want that. You want to kind of try and get this kind of as thin as you can before joining it onto there. Again, looking at the shape, checking it's not barreling in too much. And this is by no means finished. So you can see that, again, like I was saying before, you're going to want to open your bowl out. You're going to want to make it a lot thinner and prettier before you join it. But in principle, what you're doing now is you are wetting this in the same way as before, and the same down here, and then you're going to do it again. You might want this to not kind of sit out a little bit over the top of the cup. That might be a stylistic decision, or you might want to make sure it really is a bit kind of thinner and matches up more closely with the stem. So play around with that. You'll be able to feel the kind of physics of the cup as well. Like if it's not balancing and it's not sturdy, you're going to be able to feel that when you're joining it. And as you can see, this is just about balancing, but it could be a lot better. The other thing you can do is, if your base is dry, you might actually want to join it the other way up. So you might find it easier to actually turn it over. Because my base isn't that dry yet, I'm not going to do it with mine, but you might find it easier to pick up your base and join it onto the bottom that way. So you're going to sip and score together, and then again, you can either kind of leave it looking how it does. This is obviously as well not an even weight with one handle, so you want to think about things like that as well, because if you've only got a handle on one side, I mean, it's a subtle difference, but you want to think about the weight being exactly the same. And if it doesn't seem to be kind of adding up, you can take it off, you can play with it, and you'll start to get a sense of when it's like sitting evenly. That's not quite there. But you also might, even at this point, if your clay is still malleable enough, you might decide that you want a shorter stem. You might decide you want a longer stem, and you can cut it down. But essentially, once you've joined both your handles, you've got a shape that you're really happy with. You can see as well that wasn't sitting in the centre, so you need to make sure you've got it sitting right in the centre of there. And yeah, you can keep playing with the shape, and then you will eventually have a Kylix a little bit like the one I showed you earlier, but make it your own. You know, you could play with. You don't have to follow the shape of the Minoan Kylix. You could play with the shape of the rim. You might want, this is getting a bit dry now, but you might even decide that you want like a wavy rim or something. You'll need to do that when the clay is much more wet than it is right now, but you might decide you want to make your rim undulate. You might decide that you want lots of making marks on it. You might want to play with texture. So, you know, you can really do whatever you want to make this your own. You might also decide that you want to kind of engrave into the clay. If you're going to do that, you want to do it when it's quite a lot harder as well. That's quite a helpful way to kind of reshape. And make sure as well, all the time you're making, you're not crushing things. So you can see that I've slightly crushed that handle there. So as you're continuing and like adding bits all the time, go back, check you haven't marked the clay, because once it's dry, it's very difficult to correct. I quite like it blended it into the bottom, a bit like the Kylix from the collection, and you're going to join it in like that. And again, that's sticking quite well there, so I don't really feel the need to kind of blend that in too much, but I think if you've got a really good anchor at the bottom where it's really well joined, that's really helpful. So again, keep comparing. They're not quite the same yet, but keep blending and comparing till you're happy with it. And I really look forward to seeing all your Kylixes when they're finished and the unique shapes and styles that you come up with. But as a very, you know, very rough, vague example, that's what you've got. But yes, you might decide that you also want to, at some point, you know, you might decide it's not worked for whatever reason and you want to start again. And because it's clay, and particularly with air drying clay, you can do that. So don't worry if it doesn't work perfectly first time. This is a really hard project and will require lots of kind of time, and you might not find that, you know, it's perfect the first time around. So just keep playing with the clay, and once you've got a form you're really happy with, we'll be having an opportunity to photograph them and show them in an online exhibition at the museum. If you've watched the Kylix demo and you thought, gosh, that looked really, really hard, I don't want to do that, you are welcome to do the easier option, which doesn't involve the stem, and is a lot kind of quicker and simpler. So what you do then is you follow the same steps for the base. You may want to work with a slightly smaller base. So this is quite a large base that I used for the Kylix to kind of match up with quite a large cup. However, if you're making a cup on a base rather than a Kylix, you can go with a slightly smaller base, and you could even make a smaller cup. You've got lots of clay to work with. You might make 2 small cups. In fact, you might be able to make 2 small cups with the amount of clay that you've got. If you want to make a really big mug, you could still make quite a big mug. It's worth mentioning at this point as well that anything that you make with air drying clay, you are not going to be able to drink out of, unfortunately, because you'll be painting your decoration on, the clay won't be glazed, and therefore it's not sealed. So these are purely decorative cups, not drinking cups. But what you'll do is you'll make your base exactly the same as the Kylix base, possibly a little bit smaller. So you might want to go for more like a 6 centimetre diameter than an 8 centimetre diameter. And then you will make your cup using exactly the same steps. And in terms of finishing off and joining, you'll be joining your cup to the base rather than joining your cup to your stem attached to your base. So you can follow exactly the same steps for the Kylix base without the stem and without the added coil here for graduation, and you will just make a base to put your cup on. And it's up to you how large you want your base, because actually that's a very large base for this cup, but you might make a smaller cup in the first place and make a slightly smaller base. So it really is up to you, and you'll see a cup with a base in my decoration demo in the live webinar as an example. It's a very tiny cup, so you might want to make a bigger cup than that, but it will give you an idea of the kind of thing that you might make in that scenario. And again, you can make your cup without handles. If the handles just seems like a bridge too far for you, or you just don't have enough time, I'd say the Kylix project is a good couple of hours project to get a really nice Kylix that you're really happy with. But the cup, you could just make a cup shape without handles. You could just really put all your time into working on getting a really lovely shaped cup instead of a cup with handles. So it's really up to you, and we're going to have lots of fun decorating these with personal symbols that we've created, or symbols from nature. So whatever you decide to make as your base object, it's going to look beautiful when you finish decorating.
Hello. Okay, thank you so much for watching. And as we mentioned before, that's all going to go online within the next couple of weeks as well. So you will be able to watch it back again. I know it's quite a challenging project, the Kylix. So well done for giving it a go. And if you're happy with what you've made so far, even better. But clay remains workable for quite a long time, especially if you keep it damp or wet. You can cover it with damp cloths and come back to it with something like an old bag wrapped around it to keep the moisture in. You don't have to do it all in one go, and you can come back to your cup if you want to. We're going to take a short break now for about 5 minutes because we're running a tiny little bit behind. And then we'll come back. I'll talk to you briefly about how you might want to decorate it when it's dry. Obviously, that's not going to be today, but we'll run through the kind of technique you could use and the sort of thing you might do. And I'll see you back here in 5 minutes. So that will be about 5:37, 5:38, and we'll restart then. Thank you. Hello, welcome back. Hopefully everyone's had a bit of time to stretch and have a quick drink or comfort break. Sorry, I'm looking quite bleached out at the moment because I'm just preparing to show you some stuff for the decorating demo. Obviously, as I said before the break, you'll need to wait until the clay is thoroughly dried out before you do this. And once it is, you can think about how you're going to decorate it. So as Alice mentioned, Minoans used decorative symbols and patterns not just because they looked good, but because they represented the natural world, which was so important to them and gave them food and life. And so decorating one of my own example calyxes, I've used some natural symbols also. This was made using kiln firing clay, but it's the same process. And I picked out some different things. So I've got these hazel branches on my stem coming up because I have lots of hazel trees around my home, and it's also in my house name. And then I've added a moon shape with a fern and some waves, because I'm very much a water person and really appreciate the moon and the waves and the tide. So you can think about natural symbols that are important to you, like the Minoans use natural symbols in their works. And I've got a not finished mini cup here, like the mini cups I told you about, if you decided to make a miniature cup with handles. And on this cup, what I've done is I've taken, you can use a pen as well, but it's probably, you can probably just about see that I've marked out a pattern in some pencil quite lightly, so that, but you can go heavy because you're not going to see it once you paint over it. But what you do is you can draw directly on the clay, so it's nice and dry, but be careful because it might be a tiny bit brittle. You know, it's not going to be, air drying clay doesn't go rock hard. Be a bit different if you're using, if anyone is using kiln firing clay and you use bisque fired kiln fired clay, it's nice, and this is bisque fired, it's nice and strong. And this is kind of a red sort of terracotta, so yours is going to be a slightly different colour, more of a browny terracotta, a bit like the calyx itself. So think about your symbol, draw it straight onto your clay, and then you've all got a small detail brush and some enamel paint, and you can literally just paint straight onto the dried air drying clay. And the great thing about enamel is it leaves, as you can sort of start to see as I'm painting these little waves on, it leaves a really strong coat. And also it's, I mean, you might not like glossy, but some people like glossy things, and it's very glossy as well, because it's designed to, some people will already know this, but it's designed to be used on all sorts of things, ceramic, metal and plastic and things like that. So it's very resilient. So it's a great thing to use on top of air drying clay because it also kind of hardens it off. So you can see there, I've started to draw on my little design with the enamel paint, sorry. And you might want to do 2 coats to get a really good finish. And if you like afterwards, you can also then varnish it. So you can use any kind of varnish. You could use a spray varnish. I recommend a paint-on varnish, just because then you've got more control over the coating. And if you put 2 very good coats of a multi-purpose varnish on top of the clay after you've added your design in your enamel paint, you can end up with something that's actually really quite resilient. And you might be able to put something with varnish in it. It could hold water. You wouldn't use it to drink out of and then wash up afterwards, but you could certainly hold water in it. So if you wanted, I'm trying to think of like ways you might use it, but if you wanted to put something like a floating candle in it, or you know, you wanted to put some small flowers kind of floating in the top of it, or things like that, you could do, as long as it was the paint had gone on first and then you've done 2 really good layers of varnish over the top. So hopefully that gives you an idea around decoration. And then the final thing to say, and thank you to Hastings Museum and Art Gallery for hosting this workshop for Digital Museum, which is a larger series of events, which if you sign up to the Hastings Museum and Art Gallery mailing list and follow them on Instagram. You'll be able to find out more about the other digital museum events. And good night, everyone, and have a nice evening.